So I've asked Jonathan Fink to come back to the channel. He's been here before to just ask him with all the crazy things that have been going on over the last 3, 4 months. I mean, think about this. You had the Kharkiv invasion that changed kind of our policy and our stance toward what's going on. It looked like Kharkiv was going to be overrun, and then it's not. And then you have, as most recent thing is North Koreans involved in the war, and you just all kinds of crazy things. I brought him in to ask him, with all the interviews you do, and if you're not familiar with Jonathan Fink, go to Silicon Curtain, or at Silicon Curtain and see his show. It's actually phenomenal. It's one of the most protein dense shows that you'll see anything about Ukraine anywhere on YouTube. But with all the interviews you've done, what have you seen that we just haven't picked up? Like what's informed your understanding of what's happened over the summer?
Well, one of the big realizations, sort of stepping back, as it were, and putting the macro filter on rather than the micro one, is I think a fundamental realization of how broken our media space is.
Mm,
And even though there are fantastic journalists working in the field, overall the business model of our media and its structure is fundamentally broken. And this, you mentioned sort of North Korea. And yes, there's the geopolitical implications that we can come to, but just the very fact that 20 years ago, the full weight of that, the full implication of that would not be lost really on anyone. And the media and people would be losing their minds over this. I remember the moral outrage at the genocides in Bosnia. And
mhm.
there was a sense of there's things that are right, there are things that are wrong. And when things are fundamentally wrong, eventually you have to do something about them. And indeed, the Western powers did something about that and prevented further genocide. Obviously, we were still slow and there were mistakes and there was incompetence and there was weakness, but overall, we kind of got there. And there was that significant sense of moral outrage, as well as a reflection in the media of, I think, the geopolitical impact. You do not see this in the current announcement of North Korean troops. Now, we know that there are Iranian shaheeds pounding Ukrainian cities night after night. That
Mhm.
very fact alone should be terrifying in headline news. The fact that North Korea has made up what is estimated to be between 50 and 60% of the entire ammunition supply over the last year to Russia is an extraordinary fact again in itself. The idea that North Korea could not do this without explicit permission from China, I think that is fairly clear. If China actually objected, this wouldn't be happening. And yet that is not discussed really in the full impact of that idea. There is of course a lot more Chinese kit going to Ukraine, including a lot more, not just components, not just uniforms. We now have an inkling that there's far more being sent from China and through its proxies and intermediaries to sustain the Russian war effort. And now supposedly there are Korean troops heading there. I think on the one hand, the competence of these troops has to be questioned and whether they're going to swing the war effort. I mean, Russia's going to deploy them as it has done with Tibetans and people from the African continent and people who've been duped from India and other places. They're going to be used as cannon fodder, and it's not a particularly effective tactic. Um, so whether that swings the war, I think you'd have to see many hundreds of thousands of Korean troops, have any impact on that. We're not at that place at the moment. But the very fact that Iran and North Korea are quite literally involved in the invasion of European territory, that should trigger an extraordinary response. And it is not. It's the diplomatic and foreign policy equivalent of thoughts and prayers. It is not going to change
Uh,
anything. It's not going to deter Putin. In fact, it is going to provoke Putin. Putin is provoked by weakness, indecision,
mhm.
and our fear. And that, unfortunately, is on full show at the moment. I see no evidence that has changed.
So we have serious concerns, but you'll only catch little snippets of this on the news. I mean, it's like just like a 30-second segment. We saw more about Kursk's invasion. Like when that happened, we actually saw some on the news, but we haven't seen anything about. And I've been beating the drums about this, about the drones attacking civilians in Kherson and other places. This is like outright war crime, and the media is asleep, and I can't understand it. So, now I know that the media only has you still only have 60 minutes in every hour. I get that, and one issue or one item drowns out another, and we are in an election season, but it seems like just there's a willingness to not pay attention to Ukraine, and it's fascinating because at the same time, they're paying plenty of attention to Israel, Gaza. Or Israel, Gaza, Hezbollah, Iran. I mean, they're paying all kinds of attention here, but not over here. I don't know what's going on with that. What do you think?
I think, I mean, there are terrible things obviously taking place in Gaza. I don't want to sort of skim over that. There is extreme, I would say, it's difficult finding the right language to describe things. I'm not convinced that the Israeli strategy is massively effective. I'm not convinced that the scale of civilian casualties are a necessary part of the operation. That kind of seems to me a certain lack of due diligence and care being exercised there. So I want to put that out straight away because I know people get very irate about this sort of thing. But I also, Israel has the right to security, has the right to exist, and not to be pounded by missiles night after night. And there is not really a balanced conversation going. So I think we have to look not at the intrinsic morality of a story, because again, we can say with Ukraine, there's a moral position here which is not reflected in the news cycle or even really recognized by it. So we have to look at the mechanics. And I think almost certainly history will show that there is a huge investment in amplifying certain stories and not others.
Mm,
So it's about whether you can motivate sort of large networks, groups, etc., to influence the news agenda. And I think history will probably show that actually there has been a huge investment of resources to amplify the one side of the story, which is the so-called Palestinian side of the story, but that is also intermingled with a huge amount of disinformation that is generated by a disinformation machine mounted by Hamas and its sponsors. And of course, we know where those techniques come from. Those techniques are one which have been developed by Russia. We also know that various people from Hamas have had sort of training, instruction, and close communication with Russia. So I think we have to look at whether the media is being hijacked by intentional, disinformation networks and processes which they are only barely aware of, and the media is not building any kind of resilience to that. I think we can say with some degree of certainty that is the case. Our media is extremely vulnerable to malign and concerted efforts to distort its narratives, but it also has inbuilt biases, structural biases. And I'm becoming perhaps a little too Ukrainian in this view. And this is reflected in many of the interviews and conversations I have with Ukrainians. And this is the realization that actually there is an almost implicit bias in much of the Western thinking around foreign policy. And that is that if you are not a nuclear power, doesn't matter how genocidal or imperial or disgusting or aggressive you are, there is a kind of sort of cachet or status that is given. We don't talk and think about Russia really as a sort of second, third tier, third world power. We think of them in the conversation as something which is deserving of attention, whether we're judging them or not. And I think nuclear weapons has a huge amount to do with that. I think
mm,
Ukrainians are starting to realize that. The phrase, you're either at the table or you're on the menu. I think they're starting to twig that they're only going to be listened to and they're only going to be treated as a tier one ally by the US. And they're only going to be treated as a tier one power if they have nuclear weapons, if there's an element of fearing them. And this is very dangerous to the world because, again, the media, I don't think, joins the dots on what's going on. It doesn't join the dots on all these conflagrations that history might show are, essentially you're almost in World War III. You just don't
mm,
know it yet.
yep,
But they don't join the dots. But equally, they don't join the dots between, these perceptions of Russia, these perceptions of Ukraine, and what I think foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, obviously incredibly weak under Biden and Sullivan, phenomenally weak. But it's also been weak under the administration before that, and it's been weak under Obama. It's been giving out the signals of, not deterring autocrats, not reacting to provocations, and withdrawing essentially from the world, withdrawing from Afghanistan, the seeds of which, the foundations which were laid under Trump and then enacted, rather chaotically under Biden. And this process of withdrawal and failure to deter has been happening for a long time now. I think the end result of this could be World War III. It could also be looking at countries like Poland and others and Ukraine, and they're thinking, well, hang on a second, if the withdrawal of the US from world affairs and the loss of will to enforce international order and enforce the order that was created after the Second World War, but if that's going away, that means Article 5 in NATO. We can no longer rely on this necessarily. There's no guarantee that if Russia was to infringe aspects of Article 5 or do some kind of hybrid type operation, invading northern Finland, for instance, more provocations in the Baltics, or even a full Baltic invasion, there may be no guarantee that Article 5 is protective anymore. That means I think there'll be a scrabble for nuclear weapons because it'll be seen as
Yeah.
the only countries that will have a voice, the only countries that have a hope of protecting themselves and deterring imperialist aggression will be that step. So we're leading to a very unstable, very risky world because of the loss of will, I think,
Yep.
that underpinned the Western order.
So Zelensky was talking about NATO or nukes, and I choose NATO, right? But he's got a really good point. If you don't have NATO, you need the nukes. And this is what the world has been waking up to and paying attention to. Wait, if I get these nukes, I can act like Putin's been acting. And so I think our abundance of caution in this administration, and I'm not just poking Biden in the eye because you have an awful choice between Trump and isolationism or Biden and extreme weakness where you don't want to escalate. And this abundance of caution is actually, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think actually going to cause greater nuclear proliferation because we're being so cautious. We don't want to. But the only reason we're doing that is because he has nukes. And
Yeah,
so the lesson is learned by every authoritarian who has any ambition to become, to rank up as a greater player on the world stage. Kim Jong Un is loving that he's able to send men into slaughter so that his reputation on the world stage is moving up.
absolutely.
Is that fair? Is that your perception?
Absolutely. I mean, I've been saying this. I mean, I had Ben Hodges on the channel in the sixth month of the war. Long before Ukraine was able to retake, big chunks of land in Kherson and places, and we were talking already at that early stage about the idea that Sullivan and the administration, sorry, wrong word there. The administration it's almost like they've got this machine with a million little buttons and they're tweaking it and they're turning it and they think they're controlling reality. They think they're
Mm,
managing escalation and managing the situation. No, I think these strategies in the mid to long term, it's now apparent that they have escalated. They have actually escalated and accelerated the chaos. They've emboldened Putin all the way along. The Western powers, and this is not just the US, this is all of them. I mean, there are little instances perhaps where the UK and the use of Storm Shadow has regained some of the initiative. Kursk regained the initiative, but
mhm,
almost throughout the war, the escalation dominance has been entirely ceded to Russia. And this has given
yeah.
Putin the not unreasonable impression that he is winning because he doesn't count the costs of the war to his economy and his population. Um, and comfort of his citizens, etc., and their well-being, he doesn't consider these things as worthy of within his calculations. He's looking at rightly or wrongly, what he sees as a long term objective. And that I think is the dismantling of the Western democratic order and international law. And his long term objective may well be to regain dominance over or control over um, large swathes of what was formerly counted the Soviet empire.
So that's fascinating. You said Putin thinks he's winning, and I've come to that conclusion as well, that it seems like from Putin has no desire to end this. He thinks he's on a roll. He thinks he's only gaining ground. And you're right. He's only looking at the one side of the equation because he's not really worried about the human life. So, have others that you've interviewed had this kind of perception as well? Putin thinks he's winning.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And there are certain experts who come onto the channel whose views I value tremendously. People like Jade McGlynn, Keir Giles, Aris Lutsevich. I think most of them would say yes, Putin has not been disabused of the idea that he is winning and can win and will win. And we have not taken the steps to show him that this is the case. And he's getting these signals from multiple places. It's not just the sort of failure to provide critical systems and capabilities to Ukraine. It's not just things like long range strike capabilities. It's the fact that Europe switched from providing components and consumer goods directly to Russia. Um, it now channels these through intermediaries in Central Asia and so on. They're all getting through. They're all getting through to Russia. It's getting the stuff it needs from Europe, and it knows it, and it knows that we know it. The public don't necessarily know it or pay attention, but Putin isn't stupid. He can see the flows of products and components. He can see that we lack the will to harm our own economies. For a longer term security benefit. He can see that we are not rearming and building up our militaries. Some of the guests I've talked to make an analogy between the Munich peace, not Munich peace, the yes Munich, the piece of paper that Chamberlain came away with in the late 30s, and of course that was a moment of extraordinary weakness and betrayal of allies. But behind the scenes, Britain was rearming furiously, building up its forces, building up its air force, building up its navy. So we did not waste that time. One can certainly say that we were weak and enabling of Hitler by ceding big chunks of Europe over and over again to him. But ultimately, we kind of knew what was going on, and even prior to Churchill, we were massively rearming. The West has not taken the opportunity that Ukraine has bought us. These 3 years of Ukrainian blood and trauma
Mhm.
would have been an opportunity for us to massively ramp up our military rearmament. But we do not have wartime leadership. We do not have leadership at all. We have a managerial class who are only looking to the next election, and they, I think, were formed in times of peace. They're not built to look at these long-term strategic issues. I think we also lack a generation who didn't fight in the Second War. They don't understand the power of deterrence either. So I think we've forgotten the impact and power of deterrence and how that works.
This isn't a political statement, but uh, or a question. Do you think that Biden thinks of himself as having succeeded, prevented nuclear war? I mean, we know from the book on war, by Bob Woodward that's just coming out that, like, they felt like they were close to the abyss. Do you think he sees himself as, "I prevented nuclear war," or do you think he'll be seen historically as weak, or do you think he'll come out after this election and, you know, all you know, I don't know that after the election any policy is going to change. What's your perception, everything that you've talked about with all these,
Mm.
illustrious people?
I have talked to some people who are close to the Harris team and the formulation of their national security policy. We won't hear any detail this side of the election because they do not want to obviously put detail into the public domain that could
Sure.
benefit the other side. I think that would be a sensible thing to do in normal political times. When you're back in the consensus politics of the sort of 70s, 80s, that would have made sense, and I think ultimately many people, certainly the Democrat side, are playing the game as if the rules were the same and the rules were fair and it's a level playing field. We're all gentlemen here. That has changed. So these calculations again are overly cautious and they misjudge the times we're living in. I think that's part of the problem. Biden is formed in the Cold War. His thinking is Cold War thinking. Um, and the kind of abundance of caution would have been, I would say, quite sensible in a Cold War nuclear dynamic. What we're dealing with now is Putin, a figure that does not have a sense of restraint or any checks and balances, and there are no checks and balances within his own system. Ironically, the Soviet Union, as opaque as it was, as evil a system as it was, and I use that word advisedly, I've seen the impact that system had on people's lives, and it was not great, and on the environment. It was a truly vicious system. But there were far more checks and balances in that system. There was more accountability in that system than there is now. And the Soviet Union competed with the US in certain areas, but they also recognized there were certain areas that were out of bounds. There is no such consideration. Russia is behaving uh, and thinking and functioning very much like the ISIS terrorist group. There is nothing they will not do. The only calculation in their minds is what is the cost of a particular step and will it provoke us too far? My fear is that at the moment, they are prodding us with various acts of sabotage, assassination. Recently, a warehouse last week burnt down in London and Berlin because incendiary devices were placed in, I think it was DHL
Yep.
courier planes. So those planes could have gone down if those devices went off at the wrong time. So essentially, you're dealing with an extraordinary terrorist regime where the only limit is perhaps the caution of Putin. Putin is quite indecisive, and he himself is. It doesn't seem like it, but he is known to have a certain amount of caution and difficulty in making difficult decisions. But he is probing us, and I think the probing is to test whether we have the will, resolve, and resources to enact Article 5. And I believe that he not only thinks that he's winning, he's now starting to believe that Article 5 no longer counts. The danger of that, as we can imagine, is extraordinary. If Trump gets in, I think he believes that NATO will be shattered beyond repair, um, and then it's open season for a Baltic invasion.
Wow. Okay. Well, and we've already gone past the time that we're going to spend. We'll pick up on this on the other side of the election. I'm sure. So thank you so much for the time that you've provided, and that's quite a bit to think about.
I don't want to be a doom monger, but yeah, unfortunately, who would have imagined a few years ago that we'd be where we are now?
No,
And
none of us.
so,
I mean, like, North Korea and Ukraine what? Yeah, okay. Well, Jonathan, thank you for joining me. If you haven't checked out his channel, it's at Silicon Curtain, and please make sure you do. It's one of the best channels on YouTube.